Good morning, good evening, and good night to all. This is Reading in Solitude, and I'm your host of Reading in Solitude. The topic of discussion for today is 3 things which every fanfiction writer or amateur writer needs to avoid that I see very commonly done in all types of amateur writing. Now, of course, on this channel we mostly focus on fanfiction readings and fanfiction, but this is actually applicable to all fiction writers, all narrative writers, and anybody who's interested in writing a novel, novella, or short story. These are some things, 3 things, that every one of you need to avoid. So without further ado, let's get right into it. The first thing that you need to understand is that storytelling is one part story and the other part the telling of that story. When you are telling a story, you need to not only have good content, but have a good vehicle for that content to make its way to your reader or your audience, whatever that may be. The reason it's not just limited to a reader is because when we write, sometimes we're not writing with the intention of a reader being our final consumer of our product. For example, some people might want to write a play, but they don't have the means to put that play on themselves, so they publish their play and allow for people to perform that play. Alternatively, you may want to write a script for a video that you're going to do, or a script for a audio drama that you're going to do, or maybe you write out a script for what I do, which is essentially narrations online. Depending on what type of media you are writing for, you need to write in a way that is conducive to that media. Whenever I write, I always make sure that I write in such a way by picking specific words and by forming sentences in certain ways. So because my content is meant to be consumed audibly, I try to focus on refraining from using words that are hard on the ears. I try to phrase my sentences in ways that are more in line with spoken language as opposed to written language and proper writing conventions. And sometimes my word choice will be slightly altered. For example, it's very hard to say cannot compared to saying can't. And as a result, I will use a lot more contractions than most people would. I also use a lot more conjunctions. If you'll notice, in spoken language, people tend to put more conjunctions in rather than simply ending sentences. It just has to do something with how we hear these words and the fact that they sound better to certain people. Now, if you're writing a narrative piece, such as a short story, a light novel, or a novella, you're not going to want to write a script. Scripts are made as a set of instructions, and in essence they are commanding actors, whether they be voice actors or visual performing actors, to carry out your story for you. It is the job of the actors, as opposed to the job of the writer, to impart feelings and emotions and different atmosphere through the actor's performance, as opposed to through the writer's writing. So you'll notice that when people write scripts, they tend to simply write out dialogue. They will describe what the scene looks like, they will describe what the characters involved look like and which characters are involved, and they will write in such a way that is very easy to understand for a actor and for people who are setting up some sort of visual performance or setting up some sort of audio performance, and they'll sort of just write out dialogue. And again, that is conducive to a visual or audible performance, but it's not very conducive to a good reading experience. And so that is why if you're trying to write a novel, a novella, or a short story, or any other textual-based piece of fiction, it is important that you write in a way that is conducive to that. The reason that we use this type of writing that we do for narrative writing is because all of the detail and all of the experience is based upon what is being read. It is important that we put details in, that we discuss what is being felt, what is being experienced, what is being thought as it is happening, so that the reader can understand. The reader needs to focus less on really critically thinking about every single thing that's going on and totally breaking it down, and really should be more focused on reading through the story as it progresses. Now, I know that some people might argue, well, literature is art and it needs to be appreciated and it needs to be really mulled over. And while that is true, the thing is, a piece of literature should be able to be consumed when being read casually, and it should not be necessary that one read deeply into your story. It should instead just be beneficial that one read deeply into your story. The next issue that I commonly see in fiction writing is not picking the right perspective. Perspective is, like all things in literature, a literary device. Everything in literature should be done for a reason. This includes choosing the perspective with which you are going to tell your story. If you are going to write your story in first-person perspective, there should be a reason for writing in first-person perspective. Likewise, if you're going to write a story in third-person perspective, there should be a reason for writing in third-person perspective. If there is not, and it's important to understand that all people will have default perspectives. For example, when I write, I tend to default to a first-person perspective. And my good friend A.J. Wright, when she writes, tends to favor a third-person perspective. Needless to say, when you choose a perspective, it is important that you lean into that and that you use that perspective to its fullest extent. What I mean by some people choosing the wrong perspective is sometimes people will want to write a story which focuses on more than one character, and instead of choosing something like a third-person perspective, which will much better facilitate the ability to look into multiple characters' minds and see their feelings and emotions and what's going on behind the scenes, they will instead choose a first-person perspective and switch perspectives halfway through the chapter. This is an issue because chapters are not the same thing as scenes. Going back to the difference between something like a play and a narrative piece, a chapter is a group of ideas that are joined in some way. Usually they're joined in the progression of one particular idea or one particular piece of the plot, and a scene is a group of events that take place within one particular area. The reason that scenes are done as they are is because, of course, one has to set up a stage or has to set up a filming area or a recording area that is meant to be a visual piece, and so typically scenes will all take place in one area and sometimes might include multiple ideas and multiple developments to the plot. On the other hand, a chapter can take place over many different areas, all just being joined by one development of plot or a certain idea. When you split a chapter between two characters' experiences, it is no longer a uniform idea. The only thing that's really joining these two things is the fact that it is two experiences of a certain event, but the event is no longer the main focus. Instead, the experiences of that event are the main focus. And because you have two different characters, they are two different groups of ideas. And as a result, they simply are not compatible within the same chapter. Now, while you could remedy this by breaking up the chapters by different people's perspectives, it would instead be much simpler and easier to simply write in the third-person perspective. This leads me into the final mistake that many writers make, and that is something that we have already discussed, which is not using the perspective they've chosen to its full extent. First-person perspective has many different pluses and minuses. There are certain good things about using a perspective and certain pitfalls or shortcomings of using a perspective. For example, third-person perspective does not allow you as much time to analyze a certain character, due to the fact that you might be analyzing more than one character in a third-person omniscient perspective. You don't really have as much time to sit and look and analyze a character very deeply. You could do that, however, by using a third-person limited perspective or a first-person perspective. First-person perspective allows you the ability to see through a character's eyes and allows you to get very deep into that character's thoughts and feelings and into their emotions and really into their mind, which is sometimes exactly what you want in a story. Second-person perspective is a little more hard to find a good use for. Second-person perspective works well for things like instructions and for certain types of stories, most notably the infamous X-Reader story. That's not to say that you will only find second-person perspective in X-Reader stories, but just understand that one of the most abundant examples of second-person perspective is X-Reader stories. And with all that being said, I hope you're all doing well, and I bid you all a good night.